Because of what Kevin is going to do later, if you are a parent of a kindergartner, during the invitation song, would you go get your kids out of Little Lambs and bring them back in? It's not a very big group, but if your children are in Little Lambs and they're in kindergarten, would you go get them during the invitation song, bring them back in here, and then we can do the thing later? Would you do that? Thank you. Back in August 2012, the New York Times carried this story from their archives. It was written by Alex Stone, entitled, "Why Waiting is Torture." And this is how it began. Some years ago, executives at a Houston airport faced a troubling customer relations issue. Passengers were lodging an inordinate number of complaints about the long wait at baggage claim. In response, the executives increased the number of baggage handlers working that shift, and the plan worked. The average wait fell to 8 minutes, well within industry benchmarks, but the complaints persisted. Puzzled, the airport executives undertook a more careful on-site analysis. They found it took passengers a minute to walk from their arrival gate to baggage claim, but 7 minutes more to get their bags. So roughly 88% of their time was spent standing around waiting for their bags. So the airport decided on a new approach. Instead of reducing wait time, it moved the arrival gates away from the main terminal and routed bags to the outermost carousel, and passengers then had to walk 6 times longer to get their bags, and complaints dropped to near zero. He goes on to say there's something within us it's relative when we think of time. How long does it take? It depends on what you think is going on. So even if our wait time in a grocery store line is not very long, if you look to the left and their line is going faster, you get mad. If we spend our time looking around, comparing to others, standing still and not moving, we're upset. If we are occupied, if we find something to do, even if it's walking for a mile, we find it more easily able to wait. You may notice mirrors sometimes at an elevator to check your hair while you're waiting. You may notice magazines about celebrities at the local checkout lane at your grocery store. There's a reason for that. Disney theme parks have perfected the idea of keeping guests moving and entertaining them while waiting in a ridiculously long line. And the worst thing you can do is stand still and do nothing while waiting. And then he says something at the end of the article. Listen to this. Fairness dictates that the length of a line should be commensurate with the value of the product or service for which we're waiting. Listen, the more valuable it is, the longer one is willing to wait for it. We have come to 2 Samuel 5, and it seems that David has been waiting forever to be king. The crown, though, the throne, the honor, the responsibility, the opportunity to do exactly what God had called him to do, anointed him to do, shaped him to do, is valuable, and it's worth waiting for, so David just waits. It seems like a long time he's just been waiting, but not standing still, mind you. Running, not walking, running. And while he's been running for his life, God has been preparing him for what happens now. In this chapter, in 2 Samuel, which is also repeated in 1 Chronicles 11, David was anointed way back then, maybe a young teenager. And by this time, some 20 years later maybe, all that time has passed. He's now anointed a second time from the tribe of Judah, reigning over them for some time. But now it all comes together. His waiting ends today. It happened like this. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And as the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." When all of the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and a half, and in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. David's already been reigning over one tribe, The rest of the people, the representatives from all the other tribes have now come to find David. Notice they came to David. David didn't go to them. He didn't seek out the throne. He didn't take the crown off the king's head. He waited. He had chances to do it, but he waited. And he waited for God to move, and God did it. He didn't take matters into his own hands to do it his way. He watched the faithfulness of God bring about the promises of God to the one who trusts in God. Listen to what the people just said. From all over, from the tribes and territories of Israel, they came saying the same thing. They all agreed on this. Number one, David, you're one of us, flesh and blood. You are related to us. We are one with you. We're Israelites in this struggle. Number two, you're the true leader of the army, even while Saul reigned. All those successes in Israel, it was you, not Saul. And number three, God's already promised you, David, that you would be our ruler, that you would shepherd the people. And notice the word shepherd. And with that, the leaders of the people sat down with David and hammered out the details, pen to paper probably, figuring out what this will do, what it will be, what it will look like. We're not privy to the points of the details, but the pact is made. The holy covenant before God, between David and the people. This is what the kingdom will be from now on. This is what I'll do. This is what we'll do. God promises, it happens, and it finally happens. David, king of all Israel. David wastes no time in picking his new home. The city that will be center and capital of the kingdom of Israel, even today, as Muslims and Jews and Christians call that place special and sacred. It will be that even to this day, but back then it was just owned and occupied by the Jebusites. The city's name was Jerusalem. It means something to us, but not so much to them, the Israelites back then, until David conquered it. And David made it his home. And David, from then on, would be his city. That city would be called the City of David. By the way, you can read for yourself in the text, the Jebusites didn't really think David could take it. They traded jabs with David, and David with them, each mocking the other. But with the Lord's help, David made quick work of the conquest and made the city his own. And today it is still great. But why Jerusalem? Why Jerusalem back then, David? Well, strategically located between David's people of Judah and Saul's people of Benjamin. Central to the tribes of Israel, favoring all but not giving too much favor to anyone. And truly a great city, a strong city, built on a hill, easily defendable. Water from underneath the ground, it will be increasingly wonderful for anybody who occupies it. And it will be strengthened by David and made larger still. Besides all of that, if you are a believer in the Scriptures, you know why Jerusalem is it. Someday, in the rest of the story, it is where Jesus will do his greatest work in all of history. And then back to the text. It's not only the Israelites enjoying some local successes, they're becoming well known. Now people are talking about that nation called Israel, now a united nation, only under David, finally under David. And it's the king of Tyre who first recognizes David as this international hero, and Israel is this powerhouse in the region. And so he honors David and all of Israel by sending the makings and the workers to build David's palace, and it must have been incredible. And all of that's not lost on David. He's honored by the gesture, truly he is, but knows this is God who is doing this. This is not me. David is being recognized by others as the legitimate king of this first-time legitimate nation, united front, and David recognizes it is God who is doing all of this. And that is what sets David apart from Saul, his predecessor, and from every other king who would follow him. He truly honored the Lord and gave him credit for all of this. And even while the chapter goes on to speak of David's successes against the invading Philistine army, you can't help but miss, as God is directing his footsteps and leading him in these battle charges, and you'll see a miracle happen there at the end of the chapter. But pay attention to verses 13 to 16 too, because God puts it there. This disappointing saga of David choosing even more wives and more concubines now that he's in Jerusalem. And the children are born to them, but they will become almost a footnote in history, as if, who are they? Disappointment, sure. Successes, absolutely. And the story will continue, and we'll pick it up next week. But just keep an eye on what God is doing, because He's up to something. Pay attention to what He's doing as He builds His nation, almost like a child with Lincoln logs. He builds up Israel at the same time. It's not so much the nation as the people. And right now, the man who leads it, David, now king of all Israel. When I was thinking about David becoming king in this somewhat quiet way, I think, I thought back to how George Washington became our president in the very beginning of this country. Maybe you don't know the story. Ron Chernow of the Smithsonian Magazine describes how reluctant Washington was to become the first president of the United States, and everyone wanted it, everybody. He received all 69 votes of the Electoral College. He is the first and only in our history to receive the unanimous election. He was humbled by the prospect. He really feared he would lose his private life and his happiness. He loved his home at Mount Vernon. If you've been there, you know how beautiful it is. He wasn't sure that he was even up for the task, a very humble man. But everybody was saying, you need to do this. He would be the perfect first leader of the free country. When Charles Thompson was dispatched by Congress to make that trek all the way to his home over some really hard places on the map, Washington is there and he receives the man. And when he tells him what has happened, Washington's response was, I wish there may not be reason for regretting the choice. I hope you don't live to regret this. Me either. Listen to the humility. But he goes on to say, all I can promise is only that which can be accomplished by an honest zeal. And with that, he accepts it, still embarrassed by the pomp and circumstance along the way, the honors that are laid at his feet. And in his humility and faith in God, they become evident even as he stands to speak at that inaugural address of 1789, where he says, and we don't always use this kind of language, but listen to him speak. It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being, God, who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. In tendering this homage to the great author, again God, of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large, less than either. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand, again God, which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Now, please don't tell anybody these days that our presidents used to talk a lot about the Lord. That would offend some. But this kind of humility that is in George Washington, this kind of humility that is in David the king. Everybody comes to David to make him the king. Everybody comes to Washington to make him the president. And there seems to be a lot of humility in both of those individuals, but especially in David, who is pointing to the Lord as the mover and the shaker, the creator and sustainer, the protector and savior of the people of Israel. George Washington is a great president of the United States, the first one. David, the second king, but the son of Jesse, does a better job than the first, and nobody will do it quite like him. And the way they each recognized the leadership, God's leadership among them, was really exceptional. But there is one who should have worn the honor and the crown and been lauded by all, but his coming for his kingdom and his rule was different. This one himself was different. This was no mere man. This was Jesus, Son of the Most High God. He was man, but so much more than mere man, for he himself was God. And John, as he starts his gospel, points that out very clearly and sums it up with this: the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. The honors that Washington received, the Lord himself did not. The honors that David received, the world refused to give to the one who deserved the greatest of honors. But it appears that Jesus did not mind too much at all. He willingly passed on it. He gladly gave it up to accomplish his purpose for coming in the first place. Instead of being made some first president, instead of being made a king with a real crown and a throne, he sat differently with a different crown on his head. This one was made of thorns, and he was not able to sit. He did not ascend a throne, but laid upon a cross and hung there with not many subjects, but just some disciples. And with that sorry story, he did what nobody else could do. As he died, strangely enough, he was saving the world from their sins. And that cannot be said any better than Paul already said it in Philippians 2. It's what we already read if you listened. He, Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be held on to or used to his own advantage, but rather, instead, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of man, but a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And where did he die? On a lonely cross for the sins of the world, just outside the city of David, Jerusalem, conquered way back then by David himself. And while David conquered, Jesus died. But nobody conquered like Jesus did in his death and his resurrection. Truly, in dying and being defeated, he became the greatest conqueror of all, defeating sin and death so that we could also be victorious over our own sin and grave. And Hebrews 13 does something interesting, and it invites us all to follow Jesus. Where? Outside the city, outside the camp. Come and bear the disgrace of Jesus Christ. And I would invite you to do the same today. Follow Jesus, taking on his shame and then his glory, dying with him so that you can then live with him, giving up your life so your life can be found squarely in him, so that as he lives, so you do too, and not just now, but forever and with him. So I invite you to do the same. Let's stand and sing. Come if you need to.